The night was still except for the faint hum of a generator in the distance. A dull light flickered through the window of a modest apartment, casting shadows that danced uneasily across the walls. The room reeked of spilled egusi soup, the oily residue pooling on the cracked tiles. Near the center of the room, a man lay on the ground, motionless. His eyes were half closed, lips parted as if gasping for air. A single fly hovered around his head, occasionally landing on his sweat-slicked forehead. In the far corner, a crumpled napkin lay on the floor, its stained fabric too small to explain the scene, but somehow heavy with significance. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the kitchen tap. Somewhere outside, the faint wail of a siren grew louder, inching closer to the apartment. Amaka was late again. The usual Lagos traffic had turned her commute into a battle of wills, and by the time she arrived at her Lekki office, the air-conditioned lobby felt like a relief. She pushed through the revolving door, muttering apologies to no one in particular, her phone buzzing persistently in her bag. It was Tola, her best friend of 7 years. Amaka glanced at the screen and ignored the call. She wasn't in the mood for Tola's usual cheerful chatter. Not today. At her desk, Amaka's calendar was packed with meetings and presentations. As the head of marketing at one of Lagos' fastest-growing firms, her days were never slow. Yet, despite the chaos of work, a nagging feeling had been building in her chest for weeks. Femi had grown distant. His messages were shorter, his calls less frequent. And Tola, always too eager to meet up, always texting at odd hours, was starting to feel like a problem she didn't want to face. By lunch, she gave in and picked up her phone to text Tola back. "Hey, let's meet this weekend. Drinks at our usual spot?" The reply came almost immediately. "Perfect. Can't wait to catch up. I have so much gist for you." Amaka stared at the message, her unease growing. She couldn't pinpoint why, but something felt off. Later that evening, she decided to visit Femi's apartment unannounced. The air was humid, the streets buzzing with vendors hawking suya and roasted corn. She navigated the familiar path to his place, her steps quick and deliberate. The spare key was still under the mat where she'd left it months ago. She opened the door quietly, stepping into the dimly lit living room. Her heart froze at the sound of laughter, soft, intimate, unmistakable. She moved closer, her stomach churning with every step. Peering into the living room, she saw them. Femi and Tola, sitting too close on the couch, their laughter echoing in the small space. Femi's hand rested casually on Tola's thigh. Amaka stepped back, her mind racing. She hadn't planned for this. Her grip tightened on her bag as she turned and left without a word. The next day, she buried herself in work, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. She couldn't think clearly. The betrayal stung, but more than that, she felt humiliated. By evening, the idea came to her as she stood in her kitchen. She stared at the ingredients on the counter: egusi, palm oil, crayfish. It was Femi's favorite dish, the one he always asked her to make. Her hands moved mechanically, preparing the soup, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment she saw them together. Then her eyes fell on the bathroom door. She paused, the thought creeping into her mind slowly. Her lips tightened. She shook her head, trying to push it away, but it lingered. It wasn't about hurting him, she told herself. It was about sending a message, a petty silent retaliation for the pain he'd caused her. Her hands trembled slightly as she made her decision. Amaka stood still for a moment, her breath shallow as the idea took root. She opened the bathroom door, her footsteps echoing lightly against the tiles. The small room smelled faintly of soap and dampness. She reached for the basket in the corner, her hands moving with hesitation. Her fingers brushed against the soft fabric of the discarded pad, and she froze. "This is madness," she whispered to herself, her voice shaky. She almost turned back, almost dropped the idea. But the memory of Femi's laughter, his hand on Tola's thigh, pushed her forward. It wasn't about causing harm, she reminded herself. Just a message. A reminder that betrayal had consequences. Her movements became mechanical as she returned to the kitchen. She soaked the pad briefly, wringing it out before discarding it in the trash. The liquid mingled with the egusi soup, disappearing without a trace. Her heart pounded, her thoughts racing, but she forced herself to focus on finishing the meal. When the soup was done, she poured it into a container, packed it neatly, and placed it in a plastic bag. She didn't feel relief, only a dull ache in her chest. The next morning, Amaka called Femi. Her voice was calm, steady, even though her hands shook as she held the phone. "Hey," she said, forcing a smile into her tone. "I made you some egusi soup. Thought you might like it for lunch." Femi's voice was cheerful, too cheerful. "Ah, Amaka, you're the best. I'll come by your office and pick it up." She hung up, staring at her reflection in the dark screen of her phone. Her reflection looked back, hollow-eyed and unsure. Was she going too far? Was this too much? But it was too late to back out now. By lunchtime, Femi arrived at her office. He strolled in with his usual confidence, dressed in a crisp white shirt and slacks. His smile was wide, the kind that used to make her heart flutter, but now felt like a mockery. "Thanks, babe," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. She turned slightly, letting his lips brush the corner of her face instead. He didn't seem to notice. "It's in the bag," she said, pointing to the desk. Her voice was tight, and she hoped he couldn't hear the tension in it. He grabbed the bag and waved goodbye, not even lingering for a chat. Amaka sat back down, her heart pounding so loudly she thought her colleagues might hear it. She didn't feel victorious, she felt sick. By evening, she heard nothing from Femi. No calls, no messages. The silence gnawed at her, each passing hour stretching into an eternity. She scrolled through her phone, debating whether to call him, but decided against it. What would she even say? Just as she was about to turn off her phone and try to sleep, it buzzed. The screen lit up with Tola's name. Her stomach churned. "Hello?" she answered, her voice quieter than she intended. Tola's voice was frantic. "Amaka, Femi collapsed at work. He's in the hospital." Amaka's breath caught in her throat. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaky. "They think it's food poisoning. He started feeling dizzy after lunch, and then he just collapsed." Tola's words tumbled out, panicked and confused. "They're running tests now." Amaka didn't respond. Her mind raced, a flood of questions and fears crashing into each other. Was it the soup? Could it really have been the soup? No, she told herself. It couldn't be. It was just a petty act, nothing more. It wasn't supposed to hurt him. But doubt lingered, heavy and suffocating. Amaka stayed awake that night, her thoughts spiraling. She couldn't bring herself to visit Femi at the hospital. She knew she should, if only to avoid suspicion, but her legs felt like lead every time she thought of leaving the house. The next morning, her phone rang again. This time, it was an unknown number. "Hello, is this Amaka?" a firm voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Inspector Ibrahim from the Lagos Police. We'd like to ask you a few questions about Femi Adewale." Her hand gripped the phone tightly, her breath caught in her chest. Amaka's heart pounded as she held the phone. She forced herself to breathe, trying to keep her voice steady. "Questions about Femi?" she managed to ask. Is he okay?" The inspector's tone remained calm but firm. He is stable for now. We need to understand the events leading to his collapse. It would be helpful if you could come down to our station this afternoon. Amaka's throat went dry. All right, I'll come. As soon as the call ended, she slumped onto her couch. Her chest felt tight, her thoughts racing. Was this about the soup? Could they have found something? She had told herself it wasn't serious, just a petty act of revenge. But now, doubt consumed her. She couldn't afford to panic. She needed a plan. The police station was a modest building, bustling with activity. Officers moved in and out, their conversations blending into a low hum. Amaka sat in a wooden chair outside the inspector's office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room smelled of old files and faintly of cigarette smoke. Miss Amaka? A tall man in a dark blue uniform stood at the door. His face was sharp, his eyes unreadable. Yes, she replied, standing quickly. Come in. She followed him into the office, her stomach twisting. The room was sparse, just a desk, a chair, and a filing cabinet. A fan whirred in the corner, barely stirring the hot air. Inspector Ibrahim gestured for her to sit. He had a calm demeanor, but his eyes carried a weight that made her uneasy. Thank you for coming, he began. We're trying to piece together what happened to Mr. Femi Adewale. As someone close to him, we believe you might have valuable insight. Amaka nodded, swallowing hard. Of course. I'll help however I can. When was the last time you saw him? The inspector asked, leaning forward slightly. Yesterday, she said quickly. He came to my office to pick up some lunch I'd made for him. He looked fine then. Inspector Ibrahim nodded, jotting something down in his notebook. Lunch? What did you prepare? Her palms grew damp. Egusi soup, she replied, keeping her voice steady. It's his favorite. Did you eat any of the soup yourself? No, she said, shaking her head. It was for him. I wasn't hungry. The inspector looked up, his gaze sharp. Did you notice anything unusual about him recently? Anyone he might have had disagreements with? Problems at work? Amaka hesitated. Not that I know of, but he's been distant lately. I thought it was just personal issues, but I don't know. The inspector leaned back in his chair, studying her. We've learned that Mr. Adewale has been under investigation at his company for financial misconduct. Did he ever mention anything about this to you? Amaka blinked, caught off guard. Number. He never said anything about that. The inspector nodded slowly. Interesting. We're also running tests on the soup container he brought to the office. It may take some time, but we hope it will give us more clarity. Amaka's chest tightened. She managed a small nod, her mind racing. You're free to go for now, Inspector Ibrahim said, closing his notebook. But we may need to speak with you again as the investigation unfolds. Amaka rose on shaky legs. Thank you, she said quietly before leaving the office. The drive home felt like a blur. As she navigated the chaotic Lagos traffic, her mind swirled with questions. What did the inspector mean about Femi's financial misconduct? Could someone else have poisoned him? Was she already a suspect? By the time she got home, she felt like she was suffocating. She sat on her couch, staring blankly at the wall. She hadn't intended to harm him, but now everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Tola. Amaka! Tola's voice was frantic, her words rushing out. The doctors found something strange in Femi's system. They said it wasn't food poisoning. It was deliberate. Someone tried to poison him. Amaka's breath caught. What? Who would do that? I don't know, Tola said, her voice breaking. But the police are looking into it. They said they'll be questioning everyone close to him. Amaka's hand tightened around her phone. The walls seemed to close in around her as Tola's words echoed in her mind. Amaka gripped the edge of the couch, her breathing uneven. Tola's words repeated in her head, each one sharp as a knife, deliberate, questioning, poison. She felt trapped, as if the walls of her tiny apartment were closing in, suffocating her. "Amaka, are you there?" Tola's voice broke through the silence on the line. "Yes, I'm here," Amaka said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared," Tola continued. "Femi could have died. Who would do something like this?" Amaka swallowed hard. She couldn't tell Tola the truth. Not now, not ever. "I don't know," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I just hope he recovers soon." Tola sighed deeply. The police said they'll call everyone in for questioning, even his colleagues. They're not taking this lightly. "I understand," Amaka replied, her throat tight. "Let me know if you hear anything else." After ending the call, Amaka sat frozen. The room felt oppressively quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. She had to think clearly. What if the police discovered the soup wasn't just food? Could they trace it back to her? Her stomach churned at the thought. The next morning, Amaka woke to another call, this time from Inspector Ibrahim. She hesitated before answering, her hand trembling as she brought the phone to her ear. "Good morning, Miss Amaka," the inspector's calm voice came through. "We'd like you to come back to the station this afternoon for a follow-up discussion." Amaka's heart sank. "Is there a problem?" "We have a few more questions. It won't take long," he assured her before hanging up. She dropped the phone onto the bed, her chest heaving with panic. They must have found something. She couldn't run. Not that she even had a plan to, but the thought crossed her mind briefly. Her face felt hot as she paced the room, her mind spinning. At the station, the atmosphere felt heavier than the day before. Inspector Ibrahim's eyes were sharp as he gestured for her to sit. She forced herself to meet his gaze, trying to appear calm. "We received the initial test results from the hospital," he began, his tone measured. "There were traces of a foreign substance in Mr. Adewale's system. The substance wasn't lethal, but it caused severe gastrointestinal distress." Amaka's heart raced. She kept her expression neutral, nodding slowly. "What kind of substance?" "Something organic, likely ingested with the food he ate," he replied. "The tests are ongoing, but we're looking into everyone who had access to Mr. Adewale's meals or his environment." She nodded again, her throat dry. "I don't know what could have happened. I prepared the soup with fresh ingredients." "Do you know if anyone at his workplace or in his personal life had a reason to harm him?" the inspector asked, leaning forward slightly. Amaka hesitated. This was her chance to shift the focus away from herself. She thought of what Tola had said about Femi's colleagues and the investigation at his company. "He didn't tell me much, but I know he had some problems at work. He's been stressed about it for weeks." The inspector scribbled in his notebook. "Problems at work," he repeated. "Do you know any details?" "No," Amaka said quickly. "He didn't like to talk about it." Inspector Ibrahim closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. "All right, that will be all for now. Thank you for your cooperation." Amaka left the station, her legs feeling like jelly. Outside, the sun blazed and the streets buzzed with life, but she felt detached, like she was walking in a dream. Back home, Amaka sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone. The situation was spiraling out of control, but there was still a part of her that refused to believe the soup could be the cause. Maybe Femi's work troubles had something to do with this. Maybe someone else wanted to harm him. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Her chest tightened as she stood, her feet heavy as she approached. When she opened it, Tola stood there, her face pale and anxious. "Tola, what are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," Tola said, stepping inside. "The police questioned me today. They're digging into everything. Femi's work, his personal life, even us." Amaka closed the door, her pulse quickening. "What did they ask?" "Everything. How long we've known each other. How long I've known Femi. If I've noticed anything strange about him lately." Tola ran a hand through her braids, her eyes darting around the room. "Amaka, do you think someone at his office could have done this?" Amaka hesitated, her mind racing. "It's possible. He's been under a lot of pressure there." Tola nodded, biting her lip. "I just hope they find out the truth. This whole thing is so messed up." Amaka forced a small smile. "They will." But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Amaka sat across from Tola, her hands gripping her mug of lukewarm tea. Tola's presence only heightened her anxiety. Every word Tola said felt like a subtle probe, even though Amaka knew it wasn't. Or was it? The air between them was heavy, though neither acknowledged it. "You don't seem yourself, Amaka," Tola said, breaking the silence. "Are you okay? This whole thing has been a lot." Amaka forced a smile, her fingers tightening around the mug. "I'm fine, just worried about Femi, that's all." Tola nodded, but her eyes lingered on Amaka a moment longer than usual. "I know he can be difficult sometimes, but no one deserves what happened to him." Amaka swallowed hard and nodded. "True." Tola stood, smoothing her dress. "I should go. The police said they might call me back, and I don't want to seem unavailable." Amaka walked her to the door, watching as Tola's figure disappeared down the hallway. The moment the door clicked shut, Amaka let out a shaky breath. She felt as if she were balancing on the edge of a cliff, each conversation, each call pushing her closer to the brink. That evening, Amaka's phone buzzed again, another unknown number. Her heart sank as she picked it up, her voice trembling slightly. "Hello?" "Amaka, it's Inspector Ibrahim." Her stomach flipped. "Yes, Inspector?" "We've found something interesting," he said, his tone measured. "We're tracing the source of the substance found in Femi's system. It's not something commonly available. We're also looking into connections between his office and his personal relationships." Amaka's grip on the phone tightened. Did you find anything specific?" "Not yet," Ibrahim said. "But we're close. I'll keep you updated." The call ended, leaving Amaka with a sinking feeling. Close. That word echoed in her mind. Did that mean they suspected her? Or was it someone else entirely? Her thoughts spiraled again until she forced herself to focus. She needed air. Amaka stepped out into the night, the streets of Lagos bustling as usual. Vendors called out, selling roasted corn and akara. The familiar noise and chaos should have grounded her, but tonight it felt suffocating. She walked aimlessly, her mind heavy with the weight of what she'd done, or thought she'd done. As she passed a newspaper stand, a headline caught her eye. Prominent Lagos banker linked to major embezzlement scandal. The picture accompanying the headline was of Femi. Her heart stopped. She grabbed the paper and quickly scanned the article. The report detailed Femi's alleged involvement in a scheme to siphon millions from his company. It also mentioned that authorities were investigating possible accomplices. Amaka's mind raced. Was this why Femi was poisoned? Had someone at work targeted him? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden vibration from her phone. Another unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was low and unfamiliar. "Stay out of this, Amaka. If you know what's good for you, keep your mouth shut." The line went dead. Amaka stood frozen, the noise of the street fading into the background. Her hands shook as she clutched the phone. Someone knew. But knew what? About the soup? About Femi's work? Or both? The weight of the threat pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. She turned and hurried back to her apartment, her steps quick and uneven. As she locked the door behind her, she leaned against it, her breathing shallow. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Not Tola, not the police, and certainly not herself. The sound of her phone buzzing again made her jump. She stared at the screen. Another unknown number. Her finger hovered over the screen, dread pooling in her stomach. She answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end, then the faint sound of someone breathing. "Amaka," the voice finally said, low and chilling. "You're next."